Clara Ramirez was a woman of modest beginnings, born into a family that cherished the simple things in life. Her father, a farmer, and her mother, a devout Christian, raised her with strong values and an unwavering faith in God. From a young age, Clara learned that while life may be filled with trials, one's faith could provide a foundation stronger than any hardship. Her family's small farm was nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills, a landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly under the vast southern sky. It was here, in the heart of nature, that Clara found solace and a sense of connection to something greater than herself. As a child, she would often wander into the fields, her bare feet brushing against the tall grass as she sang hymns her mother had taught her. She felt God's presence in the wind that swept through the trees and in the gentle sway of the sunflowers that lined the path to their home. This connection only deepened as she grew older. By the time she reached adulthood, Clara's faith was unshakable. Her life revolved around her daily prayers, her work on the farm, and caring for her family, especially her ailing mother, who had fallen ill in recent years. Despite the challenges, Clara faced each day with a quiet strength that drew the admiration of everyone who knew her. Her neighbors often spoke of her as a beacon of light in the community, a woman whose kindness and humility were as much a part of her as the air she breathed. Every morning, as the sun rose over the hills, she would make her way to the small wooden church at the edge of town. The sound of her footsteps on the cobbled streets became a familiar part of the morning chorus, alongside the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. The town itself was a place where time seemed to stand still. Wooden houses lined the main street, their porches adorned with rocking chairs and potted plants. The townsfolk, dressed in simple clothes, greeted each other with nods and smiles as they went about their daily routines. It was a peaceful, if unremarkable place, where life moved at a slower pace and everyone knew everyone else. Clara's days were spent tending to the fields, preparing meals for her family, and offering a helping hand to neighbors in need. She found joy in the little things, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the laughter of children playing in the street, and the comforting rhythm of her mother's breathing as she sat by her bedside, holding her hand. But beneath the surface of this serene life, there was an undercurrent of tension. Clara had noticed small changes in the town lately, a certain restlessness among the people, a feeling that something was about to happen. She couldn't quite place her finger on it, but she had learned to trust her instincts. They were usually right after all. One afternoon, as she was returning home from the market with a basket full of fresh produce, Clara's life took an unexpected turn. It began with the sound of heavy footsteps behind her. She turned to see a group of men in uniform approaching, their expressions grim and unyielding. Before she could ask what was happening, they grabbed her by the arm, their grip rough and unkind. "You're under arrest," one of the men said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. Clara's eyes widened in shock. "There must be some mistake," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's gaze was hard, unrelenting. "You've been accused of murder," he said simply, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Murder. The word hung in the air between them, sharp and heavy. Clara felt the ground sway beneath her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. It made no sense. She had never harmed anyone in her life. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what could have led to such an accusation. But nothing made sense. The officers didn't offer any explanations as they led her away, her basket of groceries forgotten on the dusty street. The town watched in stunned silence as Clara was dragged away, whispers spreading like wildfire. People who had once smiled warmly at her now averted their eyes, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. It was as if a dark cloud had suddenly descended upon them, casting a shadow over everything they thought they knew. The authorities wasted no time in moving forward with the case. Within hours, Clara found herself in a cold, dimly lit interrogation room, sitting across from a stern-faced detective who looked at her as if she were already guilty. He began questioning her relentlessly, throwing accusations and details of the crime at her. details she had never heard before. Witnesses claimed to have seen a woman fitting her description near the scene of the crime, a brutal murder that had shaken the small town to its core. Clara denied everything, her voice steady but tinged with desperation. "I was at the market," she insisted. "I was buying food for my family. I don't know anything about this." The detective's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a thin, disbelieving line. "That's what they all say," he muttered, scribbling something down on his notepad. The trial was swift and unforgiving. Clara was given a court-appointed lawyer who seemed disinterested, barely making an effort to defend her. The judge, an older man with a reputation for harsh sentences, barely looked at her as he listened to the testimonies. The witnesses, all of whom claimed to have seen her at the crime scene, spoke with conviction. Clara's protests fell on deaf ears. The prosecutor painted a picture of a cold-blooded killer, twisting every detail to fit the narrative they had created. Clara sat in the courtroom, feeling as if she were outside her own body, watching the events unfold from a distance. It was a nightmare, one she couldn't wake up from. Her family wasn't even there. They had been kept away, and she could only imagine the pain her mother must be feeling, unable to come to her aid. When the judge delivered the sentence, death by electrocution, a gasp went through the room. The weight of it pressed down on Clara's chest, stealing the air from her lungs. It was as if the entire world had collapsed around her. Back in her prison cell, Clara struggled to make sense of what had happened. The cold gray walls seemed to close in on her, but she refused to give in to despair. Instead, she turned to the one source of comfort she had left, her faith. She knelt on the hard floor, her hands clasped tightly together as she prayed. Her words were soft, but they carried the weight of her heartache and fear. "Lord," she whispered, her voice cracking, "I don't understand why this is happening, but I trust you. I trust that you have a plan, even if I can't see it right now." The days in prison were long and monotonous, each one blending into the next. The guards barely acknowledged her, treating her as if she were already dead. But Clara refused to lose hope. She prayed not just for herself, but for her family, for the people who had accused her, and even for the guards who looked at her with such disdain. Her cell became a sanctuary of sorts, a place where she could retreat into her prayers, finding a small measure of peace in the midst of chaos. One of the guards, a man named Ethan, couldn't help but notice her. At first, he dismissed her as just another inmate, but there was something different about her. He had seen many prisoners over the years, but none like Clara. Her calm demeanor, her unshakable faith, it was unlike anything he had witnessed before. It planted a seed of doubt in his mind, one that would only grow as time went on. Ethan had worked as a prison guard for over a decade. He had seen all kinds of inmates come and go, hardened criminals, desperate souls, and those who had lost their way long before they ended up behind bars. It was a job he approached with a sense of detachment, a necessary shield against the harsh realities of the prison system. The stories of innocence he had heard from prisoners over the years had hardened him. He had learned to tune out the pleas and the cries, chalking them up to self-preservation or manipulation. To him, the walls of the prison were as unyielding as the truth he thought he knew. Everyone here had done something to deserve it. But there was something about Clara Ramirez that made him pause. He had first seen her when she arrived, standing in the intake room with her hands shackled, her head bowed. She didn't look up, didn't meet the eyes of anyone around her, but there was a calmness about her, a quiet dignity that seemed out of place in the harsh fluorescent light of the prison. Ethan had dismissed it at first, assuming it was a facade. Yet as the days turned into weeks, he found himself watching her more closely. Clara didn't fit the mold of the typical inmate. She didn't argue with the guards, didn't lash out in anger or frustration. Instead, she moved through her days with a kind of serene acceptance that unnerved him. He would often catch glimpses of her in her cell, kneeling on the hard concrete floor, her hands clasped tightly together in prayer. Her lips would move silently, her face softened by an expression of peace. It was the same look she had worn when the judge pronounced her death sentence, a look not of resignation, but of faith. Ethan wasn't a religious man. He had lost his faith somewhere along the way, buried under the weight of the things he had seen and the choices he had made. Yet watching Clara, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. It gnawed at him, this feeling that perhaps just this once, the system had made a mistake. He pushed it aside at first, telling himself that he was being foolish, that he was projecting his own regrets onto a prisoner who had no place in his thoughts. But the feeling persisted, creeping into his mind during the quiet moments when he was alone. One day, he found himself standing outside her cell, watching her as she prayed. He wasn't sure what compelled him to speak, but before he could stop himself, he asked, "What are you praying for?" Clara looked up, her eyes clear and filled with a kind of sadness he couldn't understand. "For strength," she said simply. "For forgiveness." "For forgiveness?" Ethan echoed, frowning. "What could you possibly need forgiveness for?" "For the anger I've felt," she replied softly. "For the bitterness that tries to creep into my heart. I pray for those who put me here, for the people who believe I'm guilty, and I pray for you." Ethan blinked, taken aback. "For me?" "Yes," Clara said, meeting his eyes. "I don't know your burdens, but I can see that your heart is heavy. I pray that you find peace." He scoffed, more out of discomfort than disbelief. "You don't even know me." "Perhaps not," she agreed, "but God does." Ethan walked away quickly, shaken by the conversation. He had expected the usual denials, the claims of innocence, but instead, she had spoken of forgiveness and prayer. It made no sense to him, and yet it stirred something deep inside, something he had thought long buried. As the date of Clara's execution drew closer, the weather took a turn for the worse. A storm was brewing on the horizon, the sky growing darker with each passing day. The air felt heavy, charged with an electric tension that seemed to seep into the very walls of the prison. The inmates grew restless, sensing the change, and even the guards found themselves on edge, snapping at each other for the smallest infractions. It was as if the universe itself knew that something monumental was about to happen. The night before the execution, the storm finally broke. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, ominous growl that seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet. The power flickered once, twice before stabilizing, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls of the cell block. Ethan was on duty that night, making his rounds with a sense of unease he couldn't shake. He stopped outside Clara's cell, peering through the bars. She was kneeling on the floor as usual, her hands clasped in prayer, her lips moving silently. But this time there was something different about her. Her face was lifted towards the ceiling, and a faint smile played at the corners of her mouth, as if she were seeing something he couldn't. "What are you smiling at?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Clara opened her eyes and looked at him. "The storm," she said. "It's a sign." "A sign of what?" "That I'm not alone," she whispered. "That God is with me." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to dismiss her words as the delusions of a desperate woman, but he couldn't. There was something about the look in her eyes, a certainty that he couldn't ignore. He turned away, muttering under his breath, and continued down the hall. But her words stayed with him, echoing in his mind. As the storm raged on, the execution chamber was prepared. The warden, a stern, no-nonsense man who believed firmly in the justice of the system, insisted that the execution go ahead as scheduled, despite the weather. The chaplain, Father Michael, was there as well, standing off to the side with a troubled expression. He had been a part of many executions over the years, offering comfort to those who faced death. But Clara was different. Her faith had touched something inside him, rekindling a spark of belief he had thought long extinguished. When the power flickered again, the warden hesitated, glancing up at the ceiling as if expecting it to fail completely. Father Michael stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Perhaps we should wait," he suggested. "The storm." "The storm is irrelevant," the warden snapped. "We have a schedule to keep." Ethan, standing by the door, felt his stomach twist in knots. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He watched as Clara was brought in, her hands cuffed in front of her. She moved calmly, her head held high, her face serene. It was as if she were walking into a church, not to her death. The chaplain approached her, murmuring a few words of comfort, but she shook her head, smiling up at him. "It's all right," she said. "I'm ready." The warden gave the signal, and the executioner reached for the switch. But before he could pull it, the lights went out. The room was plunged into darkness, the only sound the pounding of rain on the roof and the distant rumble of thunder. Chaos erupted as the guards scrambled for flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness like knives. Ethan felt a surge of relief, followed immediately by guilt. He shouldn't be relieved. This was just a delay, nothing more. But as he glanced at Clara, still seated in the electric chair, her eyes closed in prayer, he knew that this was no ordinary storm. The chaplain seemed to feel it too. He turned to the warden, his face pale. "We can't proceed," he said. "This is a sign. We have to stop." The warden looked as if he might argue, but then he saw the look on Clara's face, the calm acceptance that seemed to radiate from her. He hesitated, and in that moment, Ethan stepped forward, his voice uncharacteristically loud. "He's right," Ethan said. "This isn't just a storm. We need to stop this." For a long moment, the warden looked at Ethan, then at Father Michael, and finally at Clara. The room was filled with an oppressive silence, broken only by the rain and the occasional crack of thunder. At last, he nodded. "Postpone the execution," he ordered, his voice barely more than a whisper. The room exhaled collectively, a sense of relief washing over everyone. Clara opened her eyes, looking up at Ethan with a smile that seemed to hold a world of gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. Ethan couldn't find the words to respond. He simply nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders, even as a new burden settled in his chest. The knowledge that something greater than himself was at work here, something he couldn't deny any longer. The storm raged on throughout the night, a violent symphony of wind, rain, and thunder that rattled the very foundations of the prison. For hours, the power remained out, casting the entire facility into darkness. Emergency lights flickered on and off, creating an eerie, strobe-like effect that made the faces of the guards look like ghostly apparitions. The inmates, sensing the unusual turn of events, grew restless, banging on the bars of their cells and shouting into the void. It felt as if the entire world was holding its breath. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. He lay on his cot in the small room he occupied as a guard on night duty, staring up at the ceiling as flashes of lightning lit up the room intermittently. His thoughts were consumed by Clara. The look on her face when she had said, "I'm ready," played over and over in his mind. There had been no fear in her eyes, only a deep, abiding faith that he couldn't understand. He had seen many prisoners face their final moments, some with defiance, others with tears and pleas for mercy, but never with the kind of serene acceptance Clara had shown. He got up, unable to remain still, and made his way down the corridor to the office where case files were kept. It was against protocol for a guard to review an inmate's file, but Ethan didn't care. He needed to know more about Clara to understand how a woman like her could end up on death row. He found her file easily enough. It was thinner than he expected, just a few sheets of paper stapled together. He sat down at the desk, the small lamp casting a pool of light on the pages as he began to read. The more he read, the deeper his frown grew. The details of the case didn't add up. The timeline was inconsistent, the evidence flimsy at best. The primary witness had only seen a woman who looked like Clara near the crime scene, not a positive identification. There was no physical evidence linking her to the murder, no fingerprints, no weapon, nothing but circumstantial testimonies that seemed more like guesses than certainties. Ethan's gut churned with a growing sense of unease. He had assumed that the case against Clara was airtight, that her guilt was beyond question. Now, for the first time, he realized how wrong he had been. He pushed the file away, rubbing his temples. He needed to know more. He couldn't shake the feeling that Clara's life was hanging by a thread, and if he did nothing, that thread would snap. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a conviction, as powerful as the storm that continued to pound against the prison walls. The next day, when the storm had finally passed and the power was restored, Ethan approached Father Michael. He found the chaplain in the small chapel attached to the prison, sitting quietly in one of the pews, lost in thought. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the floor. "Father," Ethan said, his voice low. The chaplain looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and weary, but he managed a small smile. "Ethan, what brings you here?" "I need your help," Ethan blurted out. "There's something wrong with Clara's case, I can feel it." Father Michael's smile faded, replaced by a serious expression. He gestured for Ethan to sit beside him. "I've felt the same way," he admitted. "I've been praying about it, asking for guidance. Tell me what you found." Ethan laid out the inconsistencies he had discovered, his voice filled with urgency. He spoke of the flimsy testimonies, the lack of evidence, and the rushed nature of the trial. The chaplain listened intently, nodding along as Ethan spoke. When he finished, Father Michael sat in silence for a moment, staring at the sunlight dancing on the chapel floor. "There's more to this," Father Michael said quietly. "I've been in touch with a legal aid organization affiliated with the church. They specialize in wrongful convictions. I think it's time we reach out to them. We need a proper investigation." Ethan felt a surge of hope. "You really think they can help?" "I believe God works in mysterious ways," Father Michael said with a small smile. "Perhaps this storm was his way of giving us more time to uncover the truth." Within days, the legal aid organization had assigned a team to look into Clara's case. They combed through court transcripts, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed the scant evidence presented at the trial. The deeper they dug, the more problems they found. The prosecution had relied heavily on the testimony of a single witness, a shopkeeper who claimed to have seen Clara near the scene of the crime. But when the legal team spoke to the shopkeeper again, his story wavered. He admitted that he had only caught a glimpse of a woman who looked similar to Clara, and under pressure from the police, he had identified her. Ethan watched from the sidelines, his heart pounding with anticipation as the new investigation unfolded. It felt like a race against time. The date of the rescheduled execution was still looming, and they needed to present the new evidence quickly if they were going to save Clara. One night, as Clara knelt in her cell whispering her prayers, she felt a presence she couldn't explain. It was as if a warm light had filled the small space, bathing her in an ethereal glow. She opened her eyes, expecting to see a guard or the chaplain, but there was no one there. The light wasn't coming from the fluorescent bulb overhead. It was something else, something otherworldly. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over her, more profound than any she had ever known. A voice, soft and gentle, spoke to her, though she couldn't say whether it was in her mind or in her ears. "Have faith, Clara. The truth will be revealed. You are not alone." Tears sprang to her eyes and she pressed her hands to her heart. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Lord." When Ethan visited her cell the next morning, he noticed a change in her. She looked more radiant, her eyes brighter than he had ever seen them. "What happened?" he asked, his voice hushed. "I had a vision," she said simply. "God spoke to me. He told me the truth would come out." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. He wanted to question her, to ask for details, but something stopped him. He realized he believed her, truly believed her, in a way he hadn't believed in anything for years. Days later, the legal aid organization presented the new evidence in court. It was damning, not against Clara, but against the original investigation. They showed that the timeline of the crime made it impossible for Clara to have been there. She had been at the market, with several witnesses who remembered her clearly. They found a new witness as well, a young man who had seen someone else. A woman who looked vaguely similar to Clara, but had a distinct scar on her cheek, fleeing the scene on the day of the murder. The courtroom was packed, a tense silence filling the space as the new evidence was presented. The judge, who had once been so quick to condemn, now looked troubled, his face pale. He called a recess, needing time to deliberate. Hours later, when he returned, the room held its collective breath. "The court finds that a grave miscarriage of justice has occurred," the judge said, his voice heavy with regret. "The conviction is overturned. Clara Ramirez is hereby declared innocent of all charges." The sound that followed was unlike any Ethan had ever heard before. It wasn't cheering, but a collective sigh of relief, as if everyone had been holding their breath for months. Clara stood there, stunned, her eyes wide with disbelief. When the realization hit her, she fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, God," she whispered. "Thank you." Ethan stepped forward, offering her his hand. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, and smiled. He helped her to her feet, and for a moment they simply stood there, the noise of the courtroom fading into the background. It was just the two of them, standing on the brink of something miraculous. "You were right," Ethan said softly. "You were never alone." Clara nodded, squeezing his hand. "And neither were you." As Clara stepped outside the prison gates for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was met by the crisp, fresh air of a world she thought she would never see again. It was early morning, and the sun was just beginning to rise over the hills, casting a soft, golden light across the landscape. She stood there for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun soak into her skin, feeling the wind rustle her hair. It felt like a rebirth, a moment she had dreamed of in her prayers, and now it was real. She fell to her knees on the gravel path, her hands clasped together as she whispered a prayer of gratitude. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of pure, unfiltered joy. Behind her, Ethan watched, standing a few paces back. He couldn't bring himself to interrupt her moment of prayer, feeling as though he were witnessing something sacred. He had been the one to escort her out, a gesture that had surprised the other guards. They had watched with raised eyebrows as Ethan, usually so detached and stern, had walked alongside Clara with a gentleness that was unlike him. He didn't care what they thought. Something had changed inside him, something profound that he couldn't yet put into words. Father Michael stood nearby as well, his face a mixture of relief and reverence. He had been praying for this moment too, and now that it was here, he could hardly believe it. He took a step forward, offering his hand to Clara as she stood up, her face still streaked with tears but illuminated by a radiant smile. "Welcome back to the world, Clara," he said softly. Clara took his hand, her grip firm despite the tremble she felt. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. I wouldn't be here without you." Father Michael shook his head. "No," he said, "you wouldn't be here without your faith. It was your faith that saved you, Clara. Your unshakable belief, even when everything was against you." Ethan stepped closer, clearing his throat. He wasn't sure what to say. He had been a part of this system that nearly destroyed her, and now he felt a strange mixture of guilt and gratitude. "I'm sorry," he blurted out, "for everything, for not believing you from the start." Clara turned to him, her eyes soft. "There's nothing to forgive, Ethan," she said gently. "You did believe in the end, and that's what matters. You listened to the voice in your heart when it counted." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so emotional, so raw. It was as if a dam had broken inside him, releasing years of pent-up sorrow and regret. He realized now that Clara had not only been saved, she had saved him too. He had been living a life of quiet despair, numbed by the weight of his job and the darkness he had witnessed. But she had reminded him of something he had lost long ago, the power of hope. Outside the gates, a small crowd had gathered. News of Clara's release had spread quickly, and people had come from the town to see her. Many of them were the same people who had once doubted her, who had whispered behind her back, convinced of her guilt. Now they stood in silence, their faces filled with a mix of awe and shame. One by one, they began to approach her, offering apologies, tears glistening in their eyes. "Clara, we're so sorry," said one elderly woman, her voice thick with emotion. "We should have believed you. We should have trusted what we knew about you." Clara took the woman's hands in her own, smiling through her tears. "It's all right," she said softly. "I hold no anger in my heart. I prayed for you all, every day. I forgave you long before this moment." The woman sobbed, pulling Clara into a tight embrace. Others came forward too, neighbors, friends, even a few strangers who had come because they had heard her story. Clara greeted each of them with the same grace and forgiveness, her heart filled with nothing but gratitude for the life she had been given back. When the crowd finally began to disperse, Father Michael offered to take Clara home. "Your mother will be waiting," he said, a knowing smile on his face. The words made Clara's breath catch in her throat. She had dreamed of this reunion, prayed for it every night, but now that it was actually happening, she felt a rush of nervous anticipation. The drive back to the farm was quiet, the car winding through familiar roads that Clara hadn't seen in what felt like a lifetime. As they approached the small, weathered farmhouse, her heart began to pound in her chest. The front door was open, and there, standing on the porch with tears streaming down her face, was Clara's mother. She looked frailer than Clara remembered, her hair silvered with age, but her eyes were filled with the same warmth, the same unbreakable love that had sustained Clara through her darkest days. Clara didn't wait for the car to stop. She threw open the door and ran, her feet kicking up dust as she sprinted towards her mother. They collided on the porch, wrapping their arms around each other in a fierce, tearful embrace. For a long moment, neither of them could speak, their sobs mingling together in a wordless expression of relief and joy. "I never stopped praying for you," her mother whispered through her tears. "I knew God would bring you back to me." Clara pulled back slightly, cupping her mother's face in her hands. "And I never stopped believing," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your prayers saved me, Mama. They gave me the strength to hold on." They stood there for what felt like hours, just holding each other, as if afraid that letting go would make this beautiful, impossible moment disappear. When they finally stepped back, Father Michael and Ethan stood respectfully at a distance, watching the reunion with tears in their own eyes. In the days that followed, Clara's story spread far beyond the small town. It was picked up by local newspapers, then regional ones, and soon national outlets were running features about the woman who had been wrongfully condemned and saved by what many were calling a miracle. Invitations began to pour in. Churches, advocacy groups, and even legal conferences wanted to hear Clara's story firsthand. She accepted every invitation, traveling from town to town, standing before crowds of people who listened in stunned silence as she spoke. She told them of her faith, of the vision she had received in her cell, of the prayers that had sustained her. But she also spoke of forgiveness, of the power of letting go of anger and resentment. She became a voice for those who had been wronged by the justice system, an advocate for the innocent who languished behind bars just as she had. Ethan accompanied her on many of these trips, standing by her side as a quiet but steadfast supporter. He had left his job at the prison, unable to return to a system that had nearly destroyed an innocent woman's life. Instead, he dedicated his time to helping Clara with her advocacy work, using his experience to shine a light on the flaws of the system. Father Michael continued his work at the prison, but he did so with a renewed sense of purpose. He often thought back to the night of the storm, to the moment when he had felt a divine presence fill the execution chamber. It had changed him in ways he couldn't fully explain, deepening his faith and giving him a new mission: to be a voice for the voiceless, just as Clara had been. Years passed, but Clara's legacy only grew. She became a symbol of hope and resilience, her story shared in churches, courtrooms, and classrooms across the country. People came to her for guidance, for inspiration, and she gave it freely, her heart still as open and kind as it had been before her ordeal. She never forgot the lessons she had learned in that tiny prison cell: the power of faith, the strength of forgiveness, and the unyielding presence of God's love. Clara lived the rest of her life surrounded by the love of her family and the respect of her community. She never stopped visiting the small church at the edge of town, the place where she had first learned to pray. Every time she knelt before the altar, she felt a deep, abiding peace wash over her, the same peace she had felt in her darkest moments. In the end, Clara's story was not just one of survival. It was a story of faith, a story of how one woman's unbreakable belief in the goodness of the world could shine a light in even the darkest of places. Her name became synonymous with the power of prayer, the strength of the human spirit, and the miraculous ways in which God can work through even the most unlikely of circumstances. And through it all, she never stopped smiling.